The Protestant Reformers are a bunch of guys who tried to reform the Catholic Church. They didn't want to leave the church, but they got kicked out for their beliefs, so they started the Protestant churches because of this. The first reformer was John Wycliffe. He lived way before the Reformation, so he never stopped being a Catholic. It shows that the point of the Reformation was never to leave the Catholic Church, but to fix it. He was a Catholic priest, he was a professor at Oxford, and very well trained in medieval Catholic scholasticism. But he was also Protestant in terms of his beliefs, because he questioned a lot of Catholic beliefs such as praying to saints, images of Christ, transubstantiation, monasticism, and the authority of the Pope. He also criticized the wealth and corruption of the church leadership, saying that priests should be poor like Jesus. He also tried to translate the Bible into English so normal people could read it, but the Catholic Church didn't like him, so after he died, they dug up his remains and burned them. But then there was a Czech Catholic priest named Hus who read Wycliffe's writings and thought that he was right, so he begins preaching Protestant ideas to his church, and the Catholic Church doesn't like this. You're kicked out. Okay, whatevs. Okay, then stop leading your church. Nah, I'm gonna stay. But you're fired. I don't care. Okay, well, I'm telling your king, and he's gonna arrest you. Too bad the king sides with me. What? Okay, come here so we can talk about our views. We promise we won't hurt you. Okay, fine. Psych! We're gonna burn you at the stake. You lied to me. I don't care, you're a heretic, so it's okay. Well, in 100 years, God's gonna raise up a man whose calls for reform cannot be suppressed. Hey, we liked that guy, and we're gonna keep teaching his ideas, and see if you can stop us. This is how the Moravian Church gets started. But Huss's prophecy came true, because 100 years later, Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the door of his church, criticizing purgatory and indulgences. He wasn't trying to start a new church, he was just trying to have a debate, but the church kicked him out anyway because he was implying that the church had gotten things wrong. But just as Huss predicted, the Pope was unable to suppress his calls for reform, and churches kept siding with Luther over the Pope. Partly this was because the printing press was just invented, and it made it easier for everyone to read the Bible, and the more people read the Bible, the more people sided with Luther. So Luther said the Bible has more authority than the church. Luther appealed to a lot of Catholics who felt like they weren't good enough to get into heaven, but Luther said that's okay, because according to the Bible, God doesn't judge us based on how good we are, but based on how good Jesus is, and all we have to do is trust in Jesus. Now, Luther's in Germany, but the Reformation is spreading, so Zwingli starts the Reformation in Switzerland, but he's the most extreme out of all the reformers. He's a good warrior and a good politician, but not much of a theologian. He tends to reject a lot of things just because they're Catholic. The Protestants want to be united, but when Zwingli meets with Luther to see if they agree on the issues, it goes something like this. Bro, what do you think about communion? Do you agree it's the real body and blood of Christ? Nah, it's just a symbol, bro. Get out. So the Reformation splits into Lutheran and not Lutheran. Zwingli was so extreme, he even briefly questioned infant baptism, but eventually he realized that it's biblical, and then the Baptists felt like he betrayed them. It's worth noting that even Zwingli, the most extreme of the reformers, still believed Mary is the mother of God and that she was a perpetual virgin. Peter Martyr Vermigli is an Italian scholastic Catholic who converts to Protestantism after studying the Bible and the Church Fathers. But what type of Protestant should he be? Should he side with Luther, who thinks the bread and wine of communion are the real body and blood of Christ, or Zwingli, who thinks they're just symbols that represent the body and blood of Christ? Vermigli takes a middle position, where it's technically true that the bread and wine are symbols, but if you have faith, you spiritually receive the body and blood of Christ along with them. This view of communion was adopted by John Calvin, and after Zwingli died in battle, Calvin sort of became head of the Reformed tradition, so he reformed Geneva and turned it into a Christian utopia, making sure everyone had healthcare, education, and justice. He cared a lot about fairness because of his beliefs. He thought we're all really, really bad, but God is really, really good, and luckily God's in control of everything, so if God didn't predestine you to be saved, you would send yourself to hell. Calvin said you should not trust your heart because your heart is desperately sinful and it's a perpetual factory of idols. And even the church is desperately full of sinners, and that's why the church needed a reformation. And the elephant in the room is Calvin did believe in predestination, where God decides who to save and not save before any of us are born and not based on any free will choice we make. But Calvin also says you shouldn't speculate on whether or not you're elect, you should just trust in Jesus, and if you do that, it means you were elect all along. And Calvin was not the first person to teach predestination, it was the standard view in Western Christianity for many years. Calvin wants to unite with the Lutherans, so he becomes friends with Melanchthon, who's like Luther's right-hand man. Melanchthon wrote the Augsburg Confession, which is like the constitution for Lutherans, and all traditional Lutheran churches today still use it. Calvin wants to sign on to the Augsburg Confession, but there's one part about the Lord's Supper that he doesn't exactly agree with, so Melanchthon modifies it so that Calvinists can agree with it, and then Calvin does sign the Augsburg Confession, even though it says baptism is necessary for salvation. That's right, folks, Calvin believed baptism saves. Unfortunately, future Lutherans thought Melanchthon was a traitor for compromising with the Calvinists, so the union between Lutherans and Calvinists never worked out. But Calvin was able to unite with Heinrich Bullinger, who was the lead reformer in Zurich after Zwingli died. At first, Bullinger had a more Zwinglian view of communion, but after Calvin had a talk with him, Bullinger moved more towards Calvin's view, and they were able to reach a consensus. But even so, Bullinger didn't quite make it to Calvin's view. Bullinger believed in parallelism, where we receive the bread and wine at the same time as we receive the body and blood of Christ, but one doesn't cause the other. Whereas Calvin believed in instrumentalism, where the bread and wine are instruments by which we receive the body and blood of Christ. But still, Bullinger wrote the Second Helvetic Confession, which was like the constitution for Swiss Reformed Christians. And something interesting the Second Helvetic Confession says is that Mary was always a virgin even after Jesus was born. Bullinger had the highest view of Mary of all the reformers. He didn't write these in the confession, but he privately believed in the bodily assumption of Mary, that Mary's the new Ark of the Covenant, and even that she was made sinless by grace after conception. Calvin's successor is Theodore Beza, and he becomes a more extremist Calvinist than Calvin himself, because he has to defend Calvinism against the Lutherans. So he doubles down, teaching supralapsarianism, which is a hardcore form of predestination, where God doesn't even predestine people because of sin, he just does it for his own glory. Beza also clarified what Calvin meant by baptism saves. First of all, it only saves if you're elect, and second of all, it doesn't save babies, it only goes into effect once you come to faith. And that got the Lutherans to question whether he believed baptism saves at all. But even so, Beza did a lot of very important work on his Greek New Testament. Zacharias Ursinus took Calvin's ideas to the Netherlands, but he was more of a moderate Calvinist than Beza, because he was infralapsarian, where God only predestines people in response to the fall, where everyone already rejected God and sent themselves to hell anyway. And Ursinus wrote the Heidelberg Catechism, which became the constitution for Dutch Reformed Christians. And all traditional Dutch Reformed churches still use it to this day. William Tyndale brought the Reformation to England, and he tried to continue John Wycliffe's work by translating the Bible into English. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church didn't like him, so they burned him at the stake. But his last words were, "Lord, open the king's eyes." And this prayer was answered very quickly, because King Henry VIII made England Protestant. Now, people think of him as the founder of Anglicanism, but the theological head of Anglicanism was Thomas Cranmer. Now, Cranmer was taught by Peter Martyr Vermigli, so he was very Calvinist. He was iconoclast, he believed in predestination, and in spiritual presence in communion. He wrote the Book of Common Prayer, which became the liturgy for the Anglican Church, and it was very influential on the English language. So if you're watching this video, that means you speak English, and that means Thomas Cranmer has influenced you. He also wrote the 39 Articles, which contained his Calvinist theology, and they became the constitution for Anglicanism. And all traditional Anglican churches still use it to this day. I'm just kidding, half of them pretend it doesn't exist. Part of the reason for this is Richard Hooker, another Anglican reformer, who helped define what Anglicanism really is. He said it's sort of a middle way, or via media, between Catholic and Protestant, and he helped define Anglicans as having a balance between reason, scripture, and tradition. Now, Richard Hooker himself was Calvinist, but he sort of made Anglicanism into a big tent that ended up accepting Arminians and people with a more Catholic view. You know who didn't like this? The Scottish Presbyterians. They started when George Wishart brought the Reformation to Scotland, and most later Presbyterians thought he was a prophet because he prophesied many things that ended up coming true. He spoke out against things in the Catholic Church like the papacy, the overemphasis on Mary, and the corruption, but he was not trying to leave the Catholic Church. He wanted to reform the Church in Scotland. But the Catholic Church didn't like him, so they burned him at the stake. But you know who prophesied about his death? John Knox, who was also seen by later Presbyterians as a prophet, even though most modern Presbyterians don't believe in prophecy. He was the head of the Scottish Reformation, and all he wanted was to reform Scotland. He prayed, "Lord, give me Scotland or I die." But Scotland kept having Catholic queens that kept banishing him. Once he even got sent to slavery in France. I cannot imagine how hard it must be to be in France. But eventually he went to Calvin, who trained him in Reformed theology, and wrote the Scots Confession based on Calvinist theology, but dripping with his prophetic passion. He damns the vanity of those who think the sacraments are just symbols, and says that baptism saves. And no matter how many times he got kicked out, he never gave up trying to take over the Church of Scotland. The Catholic Queen Mary literally said, "I fear the prayers of John Knox more than all the assembled armies of Europe." And eventually Knox's prayers were answered when the Queen was deposed and Scotland became Presbyterian. That shows never underestimate the power of prayer. So if you study the Reformers, it's very clear that they were not modern evangelicals. They believed the sacraments are means of salvation, they believed Mary is really important even if the Catholics went a bit too far, and they were not trying to split from the church. They only left because they were forcibly kicked out. It was the Protestant Reformation, not the Protestant Revolution. They were trying to clean up God's house, not start a new one from scratch. So it's important to distinguish between the churches that are actually from the Reformation and ones that are not. And if you wish to find a traditional Protestant church that still holds to the confessions of the Reformers, you can use the map linked in the description.